The Marquee Club, London, December 15th, 1967. The Who had just finished their set, leaving the stage vibrating with feedback and the crowd's ears ringing with the aftermath of pure sonic assault. Pete Townshend stood backstage, sweat-soaked shirt clinging to his frame, his Rickenbacker still humming with residual electricity. He'd just delivered another punishing performance, the kind that left audiences stunned and speakers smoking. Townshend was 22 years old and already recognized as one of rock's most innovative and aggressive guitarists. The Who's sound was built on volume, on pushing amplifiers past their breaking point, on making noise that felt like revolution. He'd pioneered power chords, feedback manipulation, and the art of controlled musical chaos. When Pete played, you didn't just hear it, you felt it in your chest, your bones, your soul. But tonight, something was eating at him. Word had spread through London's music scene about an American guitarist who'd arrived a few months earlier. Jimi Hendrix. The name was whispered in clubs and rehearsal spaces, always with the same reverence reserved for legends. But from what Townshend had heard, this Hendrix character was all about volume too. Loud amps, heavy distortion, effects that made the guitar sound like a spacecraft from another dimension. "Another noise merchant," Townshend had muttered to his manager earlier that week. "Probably hiding behind Marshall stacks because he can't actually play." Townshend had earned his reputation the hard way. He'd studied music theory, practiced for hours until his fingers bled, developed a sophisticated understanding of harmony and composition. The Who's aggression wasn't random chaos. It was calculated, purposeful, musical. If this Hendrix was just another American showman using volume to compensate for lack of skill, Pete wasn't impressed. That's when he saw him. Jimi Hendrix walked into the backstage area like he belonged there, carrying a white Stratocaster in a soft gig bag. He was taller than Townshend had expected, with an afro that seemed to defy gravity, and clothes that looked like they'd been stolen from a peacock. But it was his presence that struck Pete first. Quiet, observant, almost shy. This wasn't the swaggering rock star Pete had imagined. "You must be Pete," Jimi said, extending a hand. His voice was soft, barely audible over the backstage chatter. "Great show tonight. That feedback section in my generation was beautiful." Beautiful. Not loud, not aggressive, not powerful. Beautiful. Townshend shook his hand, studying Jimmy's face for signs of mockery or sarcasm. He found none. Jimi seemed genuinely impressed, like a student meeting a teacher. "Thanks," Pete said. "You're the American everyone's talking about." Jimi smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "People talk. Doesn't mean much." They stood in an awkward silence for a moment. Around them, the usual backstage chaos continued. Roadies packed equipment, band members toweled off sweat, journalists scribbled notes. But between Pete and Jimi, there was something else, a tension that neither had expected. "I heard you play loud," Pete said finally, not sure why he felt compelled to challenge this quiet stranger. "Sometimes," Jimi replied. "Loudness is just hiding weakness," Pete continued, his voice carrying more edge than he'd intended. "Anyone can turn up and make noise. Real guitarists don't need volume to make an impact." Jimi looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem offended or defensive, just curious, like Pete had said something interesting that deserved consideration. "You might be right," Jimi said quietly. This wasn't the reaction Pete had expected. Where was the anger? The defensive rebuttal? The wounded pride? Instead, Jimi seemed almost grateful for the criticism. "There's a room upstairs," Pete found himself saying. "Small rehearsal space, if you want to prove me wrong." Jimi nodded slowly. "Okay." Word spread quickly through the backstage area. Pete Townshend was taking the new American upstairs for an impromptu guitar duel. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Members of other bands, journalists, club regulars who'd managed to talk their way backstage. Maybe 20 people in total, crammed into a room barely large enough for 2 amps and a couple of chairs. The room was intimate in a way that made every sound feel amplified, even without amplification. You could hear conversations from the club below, traffic from the street, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It was the opposite of the main stage, where volume could hide imperfections and energy could mask mistakes. Pete plugged his Rickenbacker into a small Vox amp, nothing like the Marshall stack he'd been using downstairs. Even at modest volume, his guitar sang with authority. He played a quick riff, something melodic but complex, showing off his technique without being obvious about it. "Your turn," he said to Jimmy. Jimmy opened his gig bag and pulled out the white Stratocaster. Even unplugged, the guitar seemed to glow under the harsh room lights. He plugged into the other small amp, adjusted the volume knob to match Pete's setting, and strummed a simple chord. The sound was clean, warm, completely naked. No distortion, no effects, no safety net of volume or electronic manipulation. Just wood, steel strings, and magnetic pickups translating finger movements into sound waves. "What should I play?" Jimmy asked. "Anything," Pete said. "Show me what you can do without the Marshall stacks." Jimmy closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then his fingers found the fretboard and he began to play. The first notes were so quiet that the room had to lean in to hear them. A simple melody, clean and pure, like water running over stones. But within seconds, Pete realized he was hearing something extraordinary. Jimmy wasn't playing loudly, but he was playing with an intensity that made volume irrelevant. His touch on the strings was impossibly precise. Every note rang clear and true, with a tone that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the guitar itself. He bent strings with micro-precision, making them weep and sigh without any electronic enhancement. His vibrato was subtle but emotional, adding color to notes the way a painter adds shading to a portrait. What struck Pete most was how Jimmy made the guitar breathe. Between each phrase, there were pauses that felt intentional, musical, like punctuation marks in a poem. Most guitarists, Pete included, filled every space with sound, afraid that silence would expose weakness. Jimmy embraced silence as part of the composition, making it work for him rather than against him. The melody evolved as he played, each repetition slightly different, more nuanced. Jimmy wasn't just playing a song, he was having a conversation with the instrument, responding to what he heard, adjusting his approach in real time. His fingers seemed to find harmonics naturally, creating overtones that made the single guitar sound like an entire string section. But it was more than technique. Jimmy was telling a story with the guitar, painting pictures with sound. The melody he played was simple enough that anyone in the room could have fingered the same notes. But the way he played them, the spaces between the notes, the emotional weight he brought to each phrase, transformed those simple notes into something profound. Pete stopped playing completely. He stood with his Rickenbacker hanging silent, watching Jimmy's fingers dance across the fretboard. This wasn't showing off. This wasn't competition. This was music in its purest form, distilled down to its essential elements. Jimmy played for maybe 3 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent except for the distant noise from the club below and the almost inaudible hum of the amplifiers. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Pete spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." Jimmy opened his eyes and looked at him. "About what?" "About the volume, about hiding weakness." Pete felt something crumbling inside his chest, something that had defined him for years. "You just made me question everything I thought I knew about playing guitar." Jimmy seemed genuinely surprised. "I just played some notes." "No," Pete said more firmly. "You just showed me the difference between making music and making noise. I've been making noise my whole career and calling it music." The room remained silent. Other musicians, people who understood the guitar, who recognized mastery when they heard it, stood frozen by what they'd witnessed. This wasn't about technical skill, though Jimmy's technique was flawless. This wasn't about volume, obviously. This was about something deeper, something that couldn't be taught or learned through practice alone. Jeff Beck, who'd been standing in the back of the room, later described the moment. "I felt like I'd been living in black and white my whole life, and someone just showed me color for the first time." Pete's face went completely white. We all knew we'd just witnessed something historic. Eric Clapton, who'd arrived late and caught the last minute of Jimmy's playing, would later say, "I understood immediately why Pete looked destroyed. Jimi had just played 3 minutes that contained more music than most of us manage in entire albums. One young guitarist in the crowd, a session player named Jimmy Page who was building a reputation around London, stood with his mouth slightly open, as if he'd forgotten to breathe. That wasn't a guitar lesson, he'd tell friends later. That was a lesson about music itself, about honesty and vulnerability, and having something real to say. Jimmy unplugged his guitar and started packing it away. "The Who sounds right loud," he said quietly. "Your music needs that energy, that power. What I do is different. Doesn't make either approach wrong." But Pete wasn't convinced. Over the next few hours, as the club emptied and the crowd dispersed, he found himself replaying those 3 minutes over and over in his mind. The purity of Jimmy's tone, the emotional weight he brought to simple phrases, the way he made silence as important as sound. Pete went home that night and didn't sleep. He sat in his bedroom with an acoustic guitar, trying to recapture something of what Jimmy had done. But his fingers felt clumsy, his ear felt dull. Years of relying on volume and aggression had atrophied some part of his musical sensitivity. Night after night, Pete would sit in his flat, lights dimmed, playing quietly to avoid disturbing neighbors. He'd start songs at full volume, then gradually turn down the amp until he was playing at whisper level, forcing himself to find expression through touch and timing rather than power. His girlfriend at the time, a photography student named Karen, later recalled those weeks. Pete would come home from gigs and go straight to his room with his guitar. I'd hear him playing the same melody over and over, so quietly I had to strain to hear it. When I asked him about it, he'd just say, "I'm trying to learn how to speak instead of shout." For weeks afterward, Pete struggled with a crisis of confidence unlike anything he'd experienced. The Who continued performing, continued making the loud, aggressive music their fans expected. But backstage, Pete questioned everything. Was he really a musician, or just someone who'd learned to manipulate amplifiers effectively? He started practicing differently, spending hours with acoustic guitars, clean amplifier settings, focusing on tone and touch rather than power and aggression. His bandmates noticed the change and worried about him. "What's wrong with Pete?" Roger Daltrey asked their manager. "He's been weird since that night at the Marquee." But Pete couldn't explain what was wrong, because he wasn't sure anything was wrong. Maybe something was finally right. Maybe for the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand what music could be when stripped of all artifice and pretension. 6 months later, The Who released Behind Blue Eyes, a song that showcased Pete's newfound appreciation for quiet dynamics and emotional subtlety. The acoustic sections of the song, the gentle finger-picking, the vulnerable vocals, showed a side of The Who that audiences had never heard before. In interviews promoting the song, Pete was asked about the inspiration for this softer approach. "I met a guitarist who showed me that you don't need to be loud to be powerful," he said. "Sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one worth listening to." But the full story didn't come out until years later, in a 1985 interview for Guitar Player magazine. "Did Hendrix really change your approach to playing?" the interviewer asked. Pete leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Jimmy destroyed me that night, completely destroyed everything I thought I knew about guitar playing. But he did it so gently, so respectfully, that I didn't even realize I was being demolished until afterward." What exactly did he do? He played 3 minutes of music that contained more soul, more genuine emotion than I'd managed in my entire career up to that point. And he did it at conversation volume, with a clean amp setting, using nothing but his fingers and his heart. Pete paused, staring out the window of the recording studio where the interview was taking place. "I'd spent years hiding behind volume, convinced that louder meant better, that aggression equaled authenticity. Jimmy showed me that real power comes from vulnerability, from having something genuine to say and saying it honestly." "Do you regret challenging him that night?" Pete smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I regret the arrogance that made me think I could challenge him. But I'm grateful it happened. That night changed me as a musician and as a person. Jimmy taught me that true strength isn't about overpowering everyone else. It's about being so secure in your own voice that you don't need to shout to be heard." The interviewer pressed further. "What happened to your relationship with volume and distortion?" "I didn't abandon loud music," Pete clarified. "The Who still rocks hard when the song calls for it. But now I understand that volume is a tool, not a crutch. When I play loud, it's because the music demands it, not because I'm afraid of what might happen if people could really hear what I'm playing. Years after Jimmy's death in 1970, Pete would often tell the story of that night at the Marquee Club. He described the small rehearsal room, the hushed crowd, the 3 minutes of guitar playing that redefined what he thought music could be. Jimmy didn't need to prove anything to anyone, Pete would say. He was so secure in his abilities that he could play quietly, vulnerably, without any of the armor I thought was necessary. That's what real confidence looks like. The story became legendary among musicians, passed down through generations of guitarists as a reminder that technical skill and volume were no substitute for genuine musical communication. When Pete was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990, he ended his acceptance speech with a tribute to Jimmy. 23 years ago, Pete said, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium, a young guitarist taught me the most important lesson of my career. He didn't do it with a lecture or a demonstration. He did it by playing 3 minutes of music so honest, so vulnerable, that it shattered everything I thought I knew about my own instrument. Pete paused, looking out at the audience of music industry luminaries, many of whom had their own stories about encountering Jimmy. To the guitarist who taught me that whispers can be more powerful than screams, he continued, who showed me that true strength comes from having the courage to be quiet enough to let your soul be heard. Thank you for showing me that the most important amplifier is the human heart. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, exactly as long as Jimmy's performance that night at the Marquee Club. In that small rehearsal room above the Marquee Club, Pete Townshend had challenged Jimi Hendrix to prove that he was more than just volume and noise. Jimmy's response didn't just meet the challenge, it redefined what the challenge meant. Pete had asked Jimmy to show his strength without his usual tools. Instead, Jimmy showed Pete that true strength didn't need tools at all. It needed only honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to let your authentic voice be heard. The night Pete Townshend learned that loudness was indeed hiding weakness. But the weakness wasn't Jimmy's, it was his own.